Welcome to part 2 of our last unit, the Age of Imperialism. So the Age of Imperialism went from 1830 to about 1915. So it does go up to the point of World War I, and that's kind of the cutoff date of our studies here. But we're looking through the late 1800s again, so it coincides really well with nationalism also. So this is kind of something simultaneously going on with nationalism. And what it does, what we're going to do in this unit is focus on the events and developments in Africa during the Age of Imperialism. And we'll also examine Europeans and how they ruled parts of Africa and the reaction of Africans to that rule, as well as European and American influence in Asia and Central and South America. A little bit of that, as well as a bit of a role of Japan in some of this stuff as well. So we are becoming a little bit more global with our look at history in History 10 here. So let's begin. Now, what I would say is go ahead and read that first chapter. Nations competed for overseas empire. It isn't very long. And I think what you'll find is that this whole unit isn't very long. So it's not going to be a very long journey. But we are going to discuss some of the implications and things about the competition for overseas empires. That is imperialism. So go ahead and read that. We'll be right back. So here we are. You've read it. Let's go and review. So let's define imperialism. So imperialism, in the late 1800s until the beginning of 1900s, industrialized European countries competed to conquer and rule other lands throughout the world. They wanted to expand their empires. Thus, they created the word imperialism, and they were called imperialists. All right. Now, some territories they directly conquered and they directly ruled. Others, they were more influencing or economically ruling or governing indirectly through things like treaties or trade agreements. Nevertheless, if it was something that they had influence, that would be the place they would plant their flag. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the map creation and competition for global empires that they had. Now, we have already had empires prior to this, so we should be familiar with, number one, the British Empire, which will certainly come up here. Number two, the Austrian Empire, which we talked about already. So there were ideas of empires already, okay? Empires already. Now there was, in the past, Spanish Empire, etc. Okay, so there were empires already. But this is kind of more a far-reaching initiative of European countries to set out to create their own empires. And we'll talk about how competition becomes one of the factors that I guess propels imperialism forward. Now, imperialism is essentially colonialism, and you may have heard the word colonialism before. It is a type of colonialism coined by the building of empires in the time. So let's go ahead and look at the definition here and have a couple comments about the two. These come from dictionary.com. So the policy of imperialism was one of extending the rule or authority of an empire or nation over foreign countries, or of acquiring and holding colonies and dependencies. So there is the creation or the goal of creating colonies, but not necessarily that. And the other criteria for being an imperialist is to set yourself up as kind of the mother country, as being kind of the empire or authority of that foreign country or foreign territory. So you have to have an empire. It's not necessarily mean that you're colonizing that place, but you are taking kind of a control, economic or political, various levels of control over certain parts of the world, which you will then claim as territories under your empire. So a little bit more kind of specific criteria to be imperialism versus colonialism, which is the control or governing influence of a nation over a dependent country, territory, or people. And this one is, now I think, okay, so this one is what nations or countries through all of history who have ever tried to set up their own empires or colonies or expand their territory have done. The having control or governing influence over another territory or a people. group of peoples. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, this idea here is counter-nationalism, because you are then exerting your control over a nationality that isn't your nationality. However, colonialism, or excuse me, imperialism, is this a cause, an effect. So it is something that comes about because of nationalism too, because of national pride. You want to prove your national superiority. So, the Germans want to go and create an empire because they are the German people. Okay. With disregard for the fact that they are conquering and controlling territories that aren't German, and somehow think that because they are German or Prussians, they've got this right to establish a founded unified German people country, and then exert their German authority over non-German peoples. Okay. I mean, this is why we study history, because we can criticize the mentality or thought process of those people. Okay. And see and ask, how are they so blind to some of this stuff? Because obviously imperialism is not necessarily a good thing, as we'll see. Okay. Now, again, this is nothing new. We're going to go back to the Greeks. So if you actually turn to page 110 in your textbook, you will find this picture. And it shows you that at the beginning of the Greek Empire, they began with colonization, starting around the fringes of the Mediterranean Sea. So they could settle these places and see this as a great means for their territorial and economic expansion, as well as the cultural influence that they could then exert over the peoples that they colonized. So you actually send out a form of Greek culture to these different areas, and you set up a dependency or an economic or trade network that then profits your home empire, which would have been your home base of Greece. So the Greeks had done this to establish their Greek empire. The Romans had done this. So time and time again through history, a dominant, powerful culture will overtake others, and one of their strategies of expansion has often been colonization, or the expansion of their culture, and the kind of import and export of people and cultures from various parts of the world so that they could have control over those territories. Okay. Again, something that's absolutely familiar to us, being founded as an early French colony in Canada, as an early English colony in Canada. So we've got roots in colonialism as well, and colonization. Fortunately, to our favor, by the time Canada was ready to have semi-independence, Britain was also ready to let colonies go for a brief amount of time, until all of a sudden kicks off again this demand for colonies. So I don't know. I wonder how fortunate a window Canada fell into within the time gap that we were ready to become independent, versus Britain being able to let us go. But then very quickly after that, starting to expand its empire through Africa, as we will see. Okay, so there was a bit in your text about Great Britain. Great Britain often showed up in global maps as red. They took the color red. And Great Britain was, as you can see here, was a territory. So this is Great Britain. And we saw this a couple units ago, why they call themselves Great Britain, because they had this global empire. Now, they didn't have all these countries back then. They had Canada, the 13 colonies, okay, Australia, India, certainly control in there, maybe South Africa, but I'm not sure when that kind of fits in. But eventually they will acquire a lot of these territories here. This doesn't happen overnight. This is something that at the peak of their empire, these were the places that actually by the end of their imperialism, these are the places that Britain had affected. Some of them, as Canada and the United States, had already gained their independence by the time, some of these African colonies were embraced. In any case, many of these countries today have ties to Britain still, possibly in the form of English being a dominant language in those parts of the world, possibly in the form of those countries still having strong economic ties with Britain, or cultural ties or whatever. Being part perhaps of the British Commonwealth. And you will often see the British Union Jack, that red X with the triangle, blue and white, being featured in the top corners of these country's national flags even to this day to show those British roots. In fact, that was part of the debate once Canada in the 60s was coming up with its own flag, was to whether or not to include that British Union Jack in the corner or not. Of course, we didn't, probably because the French Quebecois did not want that. But in any case, this is our Great Britain. So Great Britain controlled territory on every continent but Antarctica. Its territories were over 100 times larger than Great Britain itself, with a total population of 400 million and about a quarter, 25% of the land and population of the world at its peak or over its history. I'm not too sure exactly what the text meant there, but you could say that Canada still was under British influence as part of a British colony. Okay, although we had been granted the status of being the Dominion of Canada and being able to self-govern by 1867, as you know. But shortly after that, we have the quest for Africa, which we'll talk about. Now, Britain, its lead is challenged. Its economic dominance, its military dominance is challenged. Its manufacturing dominance in the world is challenged. We know that Britain becomes it's a huge focal point of all our history, Ted. Why? Because it had the earliest successful constitutional monarchy, representation, parliament, a growing electorate. It had a global empire, a strong economy. All those conditions allowed it to industrialize, and it had the advantage of being an island and kind of being safe from European conflict on its own soil. So a lot of these, and more factors than that, but a lot of these factors allow Britain to easily take the lead as the global dominant country for many years, until you have nationalism unifying countries like Germany, or you have America industrializing in North America, and other countries begin to take a bigger and bigger share of Britain's economic kind of chunk. So early on, as I mentioned, overseas colonies were initially beginning to be a burden to Britain. This was mid-1800s. The kind of popular idea was we should let go of our colonies. They're more of a burden to manage than they are a benefit. However, as other countries shortly in a very quick time frame would become more industrialized, they began to compete with Britain for economic dominance, not only in the manufacture of goods, but also the markets that those goods could be sold at. And as a result, Britain is forced to look at new markets, three things: find new markets, find more sources or protect sources of raw materials so that it could keep its manufacturing going, and to protect trade routes. So to look for strategic territories for its own trade or transport of goods, as we will see. So find new markets, protect sources of raw materials, and to protect trade routes, if you have control over a optimal trade route that Germany doesn't, then you have an economic advantage over Germany, for instance, because you have access to that trade route. Now, that could be, for instance, something like the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal, or a railway or a railroad that goes from South Africa up to Northern Africa. Or something like a railway that goes from the Middle East and Baghdad to Berlin or something. So trade routes, those could be quite important. Or it could be, as we'll see later, it could be a group of islands in the Pacific that could be kind of a shipping harbor, stop, refuel, military base point for your country to protect a trade route across the Pacific Ocean. So we cannot see that, but it said, now other countries follow Britain's lead. So they're, again, a little bit ahead of the game, being the ones to say, okay, we need to set out to colonize or to expand our empire so as to do this, this, and this. And other countries are like, oh, that is a good strategy. So they begin to do it also. So thus you have the mad scramble for Africa. I like whoever made this sketch on the internet, because you can see the different countries tugging away at Africa. David Brainsbridge, thank you for the picture that I found on the internet. You have them tugging for Africa and what's called the scramble for Africa. Many countries begin to then, towards the mid to late part of the 1800s, expand their empire into Africa and even into Asia, as we'll see. You have Austria-Hungary expanding, so Austria, that dual monarchy, expanding their empire into the weakening Balkans as the Ottoman Empire is weakening. You have the Russians expanding into the Caucasus. You have also Russians expanding into Asia and China. You have the United States and Japan also becoming influential in the Pacific and in Asia. It's interesting. The Japan story, stay tuned for that. I think that is one of the most interesting things. Okay, here you have beautiful flags. Can you name them all? Okay, I think they go like this. France, Russia, Spain, Portugal, Austria, Hungary. Oh, hang on a second. This is Dutch, Russian. Dutch, Russian, German, Italy. Hang on. Belgium, German, Italy, German, United States, Japan. Feel free to correct in the comment below. Okay. So we've got a bunch of factors we're going to look at as to why empires were expanding at this time, why there was a race for them. Okay. Now, a strong sense of national pride was one reason. It was a measure of national stature to have a world empire. We already know that national pride is something going on at this time in the form of nationalism. So if there's one more way you can prove your national pride through gaining an empire, then of course you're going to do it as a measure of national pride. I like this picture. I think it shows pride in who I am. There you go. It's hard to Google search pride and come up with a picture that isn't a rainbow. Okay, so you have another one, the race for economic competition, as depicted by these charts. You want to come off on top economically. We know that industrialization is and a race for economic control, and your country's profit is of absolute importance. So to find new economies or expansion of your economy and new markets for things is a huge reason why countries are forced to do this. Now, if everyone else is doing it, then you're going to do that too. Okay. Otherwise, you can't remain competitive, and therefore you can't remain profitable. So, and then there's also this sense of Europe believing its own superiority. Again, you got to look at this one to see, well, what does superiority mean? Like, how did they believe they were superior? Because in a lot of ways they were. They were industrialized, had evolving forms of government and things like that. Definitely militarily easily able to dominate the world. So there were senses there in which case they probably were able to think that they were better than places like Africa, which weren't industrialized and didn't have those technologies. So industrialization is really the kind of one criteria that stands out as to say, why would Europeans say or think that they were superior? Well, look at it. They had these big iron beasts called railways. They could communicate over vast distances through technology. They had firepower, and of course they had factories. They were pumping out goods. There were a lot of ways in which Europe could have this mindset and could perhaps justify the title of superiority. Where the questionability comes is the fact that they think then that superiority allows them or entitles them to go and conquer other peoples, okay, unjustifiably. Okay, to make war with other peoples to take their territory. And that's kind of where this mindset escalates to, as we'll see. Oh, of course, big steamships that sail the oceans. Cecil Rhodes is a British Englishman, a Briton, as he'll say. 1853 to 1902, so right in the heart of imperialist mindset. And here's a quote from him. And I think, of course, we can't say that somebody who quoted something speaks for everybody of that time. This speaks for him and anybody who held his idea. I mean, nobody 100 years from now is going to quote me and say everybody thought like what Mr. Fallman said in his quote. Okay, but we can take it and judge it. And this is what he says. He says, "I contend that we Britons are the first race in the world." There he says they're number one. "And the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." So they're really good. I believe it is my duty to God, my queen, and my country to paint the whole map of Africa red, red from the Cape of Good Hope to Cairo. Okay? And there we have a reference to those British maps where Britain's territories were painted red. We also have, the Cape of Good Hope is in South Africa, around that southern tip of Africa, all the way to Cairo. Cairo is a city in Egypt, so North Africa. Okay, we Britons are the first race. He's got a duty to God and a duty to the Queen. It's a sense of duty. Like, we must do this because our culture is so awesome. We need to inhabit the world, because if everybody in the world was like us, it would be better. That's what he's saying. Now, maybe I do think that nowadays, if everybody in the world was like me, it would be an awesome world. Maybe I do think that. Someone should quote me 100 years from now and tell me I'm wrong. Okay. European viewpoints like those from Cecil Rhodes here, who actually becomes rich. He's a capitalist, becomes rich for exploiting African resources and diamond mines in South Africa. These were prominent in this time. His quote, he justifies European expansion to Africa to better humanity, so to better Africa with European technology and European religion. He references God there, of course, and of course to benefit himself and Britain, well, mostly himself, because he becomes like a billionaire. And it's interesting because the title of Briton, as we see up here, it was a self-applied title to Great Britain, people, inhabitants of Great Britain, as Britons. And it kind of goes back to like this ancient roots of their people. The real Britons were a early race, early tribe of people in South England during Roman times. And it's very, 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 very unlikely that anybody living in England or Great Britain in this time period would have genetic connections to the historical Britons, yet they take on that as if they are a historical nationality. Funny thing is that the British aren't necessarily a historical nationality in the same way maybe the Germans are, or Hungarians or Italians might be. It's not like there's an English race. There isn't. It's kind of a mixture of a bunch of people who've conquered England over the centuries. So you go back to the one that the island's named after, the Britons. Well, you don't really have genetic ties to that nationality. But anyways, nice try, Cecil. It's kind of exerting a sense of national pride using that term Briton, even though it's a little historically inaccurate, genetically inaccurate, whatever you want to say. All right, another motive for imperialism is missionary activity. You have a continent that is non-Christianized. The purpose of Christianity is to share Christianity as commanded by the Bible. And so that is the fact of missionary activity is nothing new. Missionary activity accompanied European colonialism through South America, North America, into Australia, etc. It always accompanies European expansion, is this idea of sharing the Christian religion. Now, we have a guy who's a good example of missionary activity called David Livingstone, Dr. David Livingstone. He went to share the gospel, Christianity. He was a doctor, so to practice medicine in Africa. With this heart to end the slave trade, Africa was a source of the slave trade, which was still in occurrence at this time. And Dr. David Livingstone goes to do what he can to end this evil atrocity, this evil slave trade. And then his last motive was to map and explore Africa. So he's got a lot of motives in mind that show why European presence or moving into these parts of Africa are kind of popular or have an extra incentive. Now, there's another guy, because in time, the late 1860s, when Livingstone sets out deep into Africa, he was thought to have been lost. Nobody had heard from him. And in 1871, Henry Stanley becomes famous. He's a journalist from America for setting out on an adventurous expedition to track Livingstone down. And he does track Livingstone down. We'll watch the clip here.
Our guides say that this lake is Tanganyika, this village Ujiji, Livingstone's hiding place for which we have searched so long. It's hard to believe. I'm afraid it's only a feverish mirage and it will vanish before my eyes. After all these months of disappointments, can I dare believe that I have won? The next few moments will give me the answer. Livingston, I presume.
Yes.
Thank God, Doctor, I've been permitted to see you.
I'm thankful that I'm here to welcome you, Mr.
Stanley.
Mr. Stanley. You're not well, Mr. Stanley. Come in.
I've had fever. I've been traveling day and night since I found out you were here. It's been over a year since we left Zanzibar.
Sit down. Then it isn't merely luck that you came.
No. No, I came to find you, Doctor.
To find me.
And as you can see, I love that line because he searches all through Africa with African guides and gets to a point in the middle of Africa, in the heart of Africa. And he sees a dude, never met the guy, never seen the guy. And he goes, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Okay, I think it was very presumptuous. But it was probably an accurate presumption, considering David Livingstone was probably the only white-colored guy in the vicinity. All right. Henry Stanley becomes famous later on, and he'll come and actually, I think he worked for, or at least be an explorer, a global famous explorer from here on in, and actually help Belgium gain the Congo, as we'll take a look at in time. And then the last reason is this mass appeal. It was very popular at home to have these dreamy, romantic ideas about Africa and kind of this unknown part of the world. It was very much unmapped. It was very not understood. The European exposure to Africa was mainly around the coastal regions and the coast. So you have this appeal, stories of adventure. Story of these territories in Africa were adventurous. They were mysterious. They were unknown, and so it was kind of this mass appeal. And you have a guy like Rudyard Kipling, for instance, who is an author and was able to kind of propagate this popularization, or at least appeal to this mass appeal, or this mass appetite for stories of adventure in these colonies. And one thing he says is this is in one of his poems. He says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need." Okay, and this is an interesting one. I'll let you think about. We'll discuss it in our review in a bit. Kipling is interesting because we actually have a town in Saskatchewan named after Kipling. So this is the guy. He wrote The Jungle Book, if ever you're wondering. The Jungle Book is this adventure story in the jungles of where? India. So it itself is a story of that appealed to society because of its adventurous nature. Okay. The idea of Rudyard Kipling and his works were to kind of glorify imperialism and the British nation. But I do want to point out that not all literature at the time exalted or glorified imperialism. There's a dude, Joseph Conrad, who was a former sailor, who became an author and saw the evils of the imposition of European dominance on these parts of the world, on innocent people in Africa, for instance. And he wrote an allegorical novel called A Heart of Darkness. And it depicts the evils of imperialism, though subtly. And it doesn't necessarily glorify them, but shows them as evil. So, yeah, again, take it for what it's worth. Historical viewpoints can't just be drawn from any one single person. Sure, there were people at the time who saw the evils of European imperialism. So that wraps up our chapter. Hopefully that gives you some insight into some of the reasons why imperialism takes place and some of the motives behind it. I'll give you a chance now to go ahead and do your section review, and we'll come back and review it in a moment. So let's begin our review. So the definition word for you was imperialism, and imperialism was defined in our text as policy of conquering and ruling other lands, the the policy of expanding your nation's empire, your global empire. We want to identify Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was an Englishman who became rich from South African diamond mines, saw it as his duty to propagate British culture and dominance over the world, their values and their technology, their culture, everything that English stood for. And Livingstone, Dr. David Livingstone, was a missionary who ended the slave trade in East Africa and spread the gospel and had that huge adventure story of being lost and then later found. Stanley was the guy who found him, the American reporter who finds Livingstone, as we watched in that movie. And Kipling. Rudyard Kipling was an English writer who glorifies imperialism. Okay, then we get to some questions. What countries challenged Britain's economic leadership? Well, those countries were Germany and the United States. We looked at United States, some of the technology from Britain had slipped into the U.S. at that point in time where Britain was trying to retain its industrial technology. So we looked at an industrial revolution. Yet they get some of this technology and then begin to become an industrial powerhouse. Germany, same thing. As it unifies, it develops a very strong military and a very strong industry. We already know that. Railways, etc., which help in their own unification as a German country. But they very quickly, especially after unification, challenge the economy and the markets of Great Britain, manufacturing, etc. How was the search for colonies a response to Britain's declining share in world trade? Well, what is Britain? It has a problem. It has a lessening share in global trade. So what does it need? It needs to find new sources of markets, new people to buy their goods. To protect its existing markets, so that would be India, for instance, and to safeguard sources of raw material. So to those places that you depend upon, it's cheaper, or it's more profitable to have dominance, political dominance of your sources of raw material. It's more secure to have access to your raw materials in places around the world. Great Britain's this tiny little island. It doesn't make all its raw materials. It imports them, and then it manufactures a higher end product from it. So it's an interesting economic system, very much different than Canada's. We're very much a resource-based economy even still. What part did each of the following play in imperialism? Markets. Well, we already talked about this. Expanding your colonies meant you had new markets. What about raw materials? Well, again, already talked about this. Colonies were needed for raw materials, to be a source of that raw material, whatever it was that could then be flipped for a profit by the mother country or by the imperial power. And national pride. Okay, it was a source of national pride to be an imperial nation. It was a race for pride at a time when nationalism was very high. Okay, there's others, as we saw, missionary activity, etc. What countries joined the competition for colonies? Well, we can list them all. I think their flags were all there. France, Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Belgium, Italy, Germany, United States, and Japan, in that order. So that's the order I should have read them in. How does this competition set up a potentially explosive situation? Well, you have intense rivalries being created between these countries abroad that could lead to war at home. Okay, so it could be a very sensitive, triggering type of incident here, setting up this competition to establish global empires, as we will see. What attitude did people in industrialized countries have toward other peoples? I think generally, as we talked about, they thought they had this sense of superiority, maybe perhaps this sense of duty to pass along what they saw as the progress of civilization, the peak or the height of civilization, which was at the time considered to be their European civilization, one which was industrial, politically advanced, that type of thing, profitable. Now, reread the lines from Kipling's poem, 571. What does he mean? He says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need." So, what is the white man's burden? The white man's burden is to civilize non-Europeans. The white man's burden. Take up the white man's burden to go and conquer the world under our empire, because it's our duty to God and Queen. He talks about this, send forth the best ye breed. Okay, Go bind your sons to exile. So the best you breed and your sons, those are your men. So take up the white man's burden. So all you mothers who are having sons, okay, raise those sons, okay, bind them to exile, a life of joining the British military or some form of British position, to go in exile, to depart from the main homeland of Europe, of Britain, to serve in the territories that you are conquering, right? So your life in the colonies. So leave your homeland, bring your culture as a form of duty to another part of the world as you colonize them or set up colonies there. Now, by the way, I like J.R.R. Tolkien. He's the guy who wrote The Hobbit. His dad, okay, was somebody who looked for opportunity during this time of imperialism to work as a banker, I think, in South Africa. Unfortunately, he died and was never able to return. But J.R.R. Tolkien was actually born in South Africa, or at least lived part of his childhood there, because of this life in the colonies and this perspective of opportunity for Englishmen to go abroad and to live in the empire territories. And then the last one, to serve your captives' need. What are the captives? Well, the captives are the people they conquered. What is their need? Their need is to be modernized, industrialized, civilized. Okay? And the British have the duty or the burden to help their captives civilize. The native peoples were, in effect, prisoners of the Europeans, captives. That's what it indicates. Now, this is unjust. Those people who are prisoners of the Europeans are actually native inhabitants of their own native homelands, who are conquered peoples by the Europeans. So a lot of injustice to discuss in a future chapter, and we will get to that next time. Thanks, guys. Don't be lame. Tune in for part 3.